Hello and welcome to the 7th episode of the Aquarian Age podcast. My name is Sunny Khan and I am your host. The second full moon of the year has now passed and we are in the waning half moon. Probably the most notable part of this lunar cycle for me has been the conjunction of Mars with the Pleiades star cluster, which has been very prominent in the night sky. By my reckoning, Mars is about 2 or 3 degrees below the Pleiades in the evening sky, in a portion of the ecliptic known historically as the Golden Gate of the ecliptic. I have my natal Saturn in an exact conjunction to the Pleiades, so this has been a very prominent part of this full moon for me, really bringing to light soulmate issues that I've mentioned in previous episodes, as well as the magical nature of this very beautiful part of the night sky. If you have any experience with astronomy, you'll know just how beautiful star clusters are. I only have a cheap second-hand pair of binoculars from a market stall, and I live in an area where there is heavy light pollution. But even with those, I can still make out half a dozen star clusters that are otherwise too faint for the naked eye. Ostensibly, they are just a physically close group of stars, but their energy says something very different. They really do seem to possess an extraordinary beauty and magic, and of course the Pleiades is the most prominent and one of the most beautiful in our night sky, so that really marks it out as something important astrologically. The Pleiades is actually a nebula and a star-forming region, one of our galaxy's wombs, and the stars are very young, only a few tens of millions to 100 million years old. Far too young by a billion years or so for any life to have evolved around, which is a popular notion in New Age circles, with many intuitives claiming that there exists an ancient and highly evolved alien race of Pleiadians whose wisdom they channel. The astral influence of the Pleiades is clearly very potent, though it can also be a very delusional and hypnotic energy, somewhat like the sirens or nymphs of Greek myth or the anglerfish of the deep ocean, which lure the unwary to their deaths. Astral objects of great beauty can often have this allure or hypnotic, delusional edge to them, and perhaps that is the origin of the New Age myth regarding advanced aliens. The Sun, Venus and Neptune are in Pisces, so a lot of intuitive energy around at the moment, and I have found myself reading really amazing old theosophical texts on the astral body, which contain a great deal of phenomenal wisdom on this mysterious and hidden aspect of reality, but also a great deal of delusion. The party in Aquarius which launched the year is now breaking up, though there is still Saturn, Jupiter, Mercury and Pallas Athena in there. And the third and final conjunction between Mercury and Jupiter is currently in full play. And of course, the first Saturn-Uranus square of the year is still very active. And we also have the Sun in opposition to Vesta. So that is the celestial sphere. Let me move on to the current episode. The Age of Aquarius podcast is largely about developing yogic consciousness in order that people can be reborn directly into the Aquarian Age and escape the devastation and suffering of being reborn into the dying throes of the current global culture. That might seem at first sight as selfish, but if you think about it, it is not, because the current global culture is a culture of Thanatos, as I have explained before, and exists to destroy the human and spiritual potential of all those that live within it. For that reason, escaping its grip is essential. Few people are going to be able to develop their yogic consciousness to its full in this culture, and those conditions are only going to deteriorate rapidly. But it is possible to develop it enough to avoid the suffering and spiritual death that will occur in the future, and to leapfrog, as it were, from here into the Aquarian Age. When our physical bodies die, our consciousness enters into our subtle body, where the feminine Shakti energies are strongest. This is not the realm of the masculine Kronos energies, which bring all within its domain under the rulership of time. So time in this feminine realm does not hold sway like it does in the physical world. And that means in the blink of an eye, one can be reborn 500 or more years from now, long after the current culture has blown its course and the earth has settled again. But this can only happen if our mind has the right potentials. In order to attain those potentials, one needs to cultivate a living connection to the Kundalini Shakti of the earth, and that is the main purpose of this podcast and associated website. So that is where Anarchy enters into the equation. In order for that rebirth into a more enlightened age to occur, so that you can continue your spiritual evolution, and so that you can avoid the horrific suffering of those born into the dystopias that the current culture will create. In order for that to happen, one must transform one's mind in order to develop the right potentials. One of those potentials in our mind that must be transformed is our relationship with power. That is, our relationship with Kronos, with malefic Saturn. It is for this reason that this podcast episode is on anarchy, for anarchy is the very antithesis of authoritarian power. Although it does not sound like a topic for yoga, it is in fact a very critical part of yoga and of escaping this death culture and leapfrogging into the Aquarian Age. So I'm going to talk about anarchy in this podcast. I will start by explaining what it is not, in order to clear up basic misconceptions which are very commonplace, and I will then talk in detail about why democracy is not at all anarchy, as the belief in democracy as a vehicle for human freedom and progression is a powerful delusion and obstacle to anarchy. Finally, I will finish off with what anarchy might look like, and its central importance to realising the human utopias possible in the Aquarian Age. So let me begin a discourse on anarchy and the Aquarian Age. Many rebellious people call themselves anarchists, but few people actually practice genuine anarchy. Genuine anarchy does not involve rioting, or sticking two fingers up to authority, or getting drunk and listening to loud music, or in having no respect for other people in one's culture, whether they be rich, racist, sexist, progressive, or oppressive. And neither is it a political system. Anarchy is simply a way of being, a way of relating that does not oppress others. That sounds amazing, because nobody wants to be oppressed. So one would think that everybody would sign up to anarchy straight away, and we would instantly live in a vibrant culture where our humanity and relations with all beings were nourished and thrived. The problem, of course, is that although no one wants to be oppressed, we generally have no problem in oppressing others for our own benefit. That includes enslaving, breeding, domesticating, slaughtering and eating animals or animal products. That includes having people work for you, making money off their hard work. That includes wearing trendy clothes and regarding those who don't wear them as untrendy. That includes victimizing those who are regarded as rich in order to fit in with the latest activist ideology. That includes aggression against those seen as polluters and destroyers of the earth in order to be seen as an eco-warrior. And that includes holding prejudicial views against men because you deem them as sexist patriarchs and want to be known as a radical feminist. The point here is that oppression is insidious, and one can always provide a justification for its existence. Many people will accept the prejudice of a feminist against men, or a black activist against whites, or a class activist against the rich, as they recognise the trauma those people have been through and can understand the source of their oppression. Few people, on the other hand, will accept the prejudice of a racist white person, or of a sexist man, or the prejudice of a rich person against the poor. Anarchy is a way of being, a way of living and relating that does not oppress others. That means that while we can have a much greater compassion for oppression that comes from trauma experienced in life, such as that of women by the patriarchy, or of ethnic and indigenous peoples by colonialism, we must also recognise that that oppression is not justified. You cannot blame men, or white people, or the rich for the problems in the world. To do so is to enact oppression and to oppress others, and that means that you have become the problem in the world. For if there is one thing in the world that we can blame for all the problems that we see, it is prejudice and oppression, because prejudice and oppression cause trauma, and traumatized human beings are far more likely to become oppressive and prejudiced than those who are not traumatized. It sets up a self-sustaining cycle that can quickly become severe. You get oppressed by a group and you become traumatized, and then you act out that trauma on that group, who are in turn traumatized and then act out the trauma back on the original group, and so on. Many of the world's problems begin with this alternate cycle of oppression and then spreads to engulf others. This is important to understand. It is important to understand that anarchy is a way of living and relating in the world that does not oppress others, and it is important to understand that oppression and the prejudices that underline that oppression arise from traumatized individuals and communities, although often that trauma may have happened long ago in the past and may be acted out now against a completely different group who had nothing to do with it. The trauma of industrialisation in Western Europe, where the rich removed the common land from the poor, destroying their livelihoods, forcing them into factories and inner city slums, lives with us to this day, and is the root of much of the current racism and sexism, as is the trauma of 2 world wars. These facts are important because if we want to live in a way that does not involve oppressing others, then that means we must, first of all, engage very seriously with the question of trauma, and understand that the world is a very traumatized place, and that trauma may have roots from many generations back, and not at all be obvious, yet may still be being acted out through oppressive and prejudicial views and actions. That does not mean inaction, or mean that we make excuses for systemic oppression by blaming it on the Black Death in Europe and the horrific psychological toll of trauma that caused, or the invasion of the Mongols and the constant threats from Asia. It just means that we must avoid at all costs causing trauma to others, because we recognise trauma as the bedrock from which hate and anger arise, and from which come prejudice and oppression. But we must also recognise that we may not be able to avoid causing trauma to others. If the police try to shoot me down because I am black, or a man tries to sexually assault me because I am a woman, I have every right to defend myself, including use of violence. That violence will cause trauma, but I have been given no choice. There are times when we cannot avoid causing trauma, but that does not mean we are part of the problem. If we cause that trauma to protect ourselves or others, then we have acted with an intention of love. That intention of love will cause us to have as much concern for the person who we have protected ourselves against as we have for ourselves or others, and in that way we can see that it is a very different action from naked oppression. I remember once being part of a group of anarchists, 1,000 strong, that stormed a large coal-fired power station in the UK. Against us were lines of police. We used physical force, not violence, to break through the police lines, and then engaged defences of the power station and the police behind it with various means, all of which involved the use of force. There were a few isolated police officers who had got caught up amongst us as we broke through the first police line, and were not able to escape the crowd. The police were in full riot gear, and because it was a very hot day, at one point one of the officers caught up amongst us collapsed due to the heat and began convulsing. Immediately a space was cleared around the officer. People gathered to pick him up and take him out of the crowd, and an activist medic promptly treated him in front of his own colleagues on the other side of the fence, who looked on. We had successfully removed many parts of the fence around the power station and were engaged in hand-to-hand fighting with the police, who were all wielding batons, and it was quite something to witness that fight being stopped as we allowed the injured police officer to return to his colleagues on the other side of the fence, at which point the fighting resumed again. The fighting no doubt caused trauma, but it was being done to protect lives and was necessary. It was the action of a responsible group of people, and because of that, no one had any problems with helping an injured police officer and providing medical aid, because we were not acting out of trauma or of hate or of any prejudice, but out of love for the planet and all life. On the other hand, I have been on anarchist actions where people spontaneously chanted aggressive slogans against the police or against a target group, and where the atmosphere was one of aggression and brooding violence. And there are many, perhaps even most, forms of activism that arise not out of love, but open hostility and aggression, and use the subterfuge of activism or anarchy to cloak a malevolent intention. So to be anarchist then means that we must really understand oppression and the causes of oppression and cultivate a love for all beings. Without that love, we will be overcome by hate and we will end up oppressing others, especially if we have been a victim of a lot of oppression ourselves. This form of oppression is dangerous because we can all too easily justify it, and many activists and anarchists do. If you read feminist literature and replace the word man, masculine or patriarchy with the word Jewish, you will often have a hard time distinguishing it from vehement Nazi propaganda against the Jews. Try it yourself on a feminist blog. Activist literature can often be the source of a great deal of hate, violence, aggression and prejudice. It is important to be aware of it if we are seeking to find the genuine path of love and compassion amidst our deeply troubled world. So we see here that anarchy as a way of living and relating that does not cause oppression to others is not a simple mode of living. It is not a lazy mode of living, and it is not a woolly mode of living, where one just accepts everything as it is and takes no action for fear of traumatizing others. In fact, it is a way of living that requires a great deal of thought, a refinement of one's ethics, and an understanding of what it means to be human, and of the deeper causes of human behaviour, of political systems and cycles of oppression, and that also requires great moral courage and personal sacrifice. There is, of course, a popular media-driven perception of anarchy as a system with no organisation at all, where everyone does what they want, and where chaos and the law of the jungle rules. I hope it is clear that that is a prejudice, and not at all an accurate reflection of anarchy, which is a philosophical tradition deeply rooted in a love of ecosystems and human communities. The prejudice of anarchy as the law of the jungle, an absence of governance structures and law and order, is in fact a classic projection. As if one studies the matter closely, it is in fact a more accurate description of the current state of the world, and not at all of anarchy. The current world we live in is at the beck and call of the rich and powerful, and that is the law of the jungle. The rich and the powerful essentially do what they want. They buy governments, write legislation and policies, print money, appropriate land from human and animal communities, destroy ecosystems, wage war, and so on. What we see in the world is the law of the jungle being acted out, and called governance, when in fact it is nothing of the kind, but is rather an authoritarian system set up to protect the interests of a privileged elite at the expense of the majority, and not as a means of governance that has arisen from human-centred communities and designed to serve and meet the needs of those communities. So let me talk a little bit about modern Western governing structures, often called democracy, and why democracy is in fact not democratic at all, and why the only credible democracy is in fact anarchy. Democracy as we know it in the West stems from the ancient Greeks, though it is worth noting that there has been a tradition of village democracy in India that goes back many thousands of years, and which predates the Greeks, and which resembles anarchist systems much more closely than the ancient Greek democracy. Such democratic structures in India and Pakistan still exist today. The ancient Greek system of democracy meant that every citizen of Greece was allowed to vote. Of course, not everyone was allowed to be a citizen. Not all males were, women weren't, and slaves and foreigners certainly weren't. So we can see clearly here that democracy is not a system designed to serve the community. It's not a system designed to address social justice or inequality, or to better the human race. In fact, it has got nothing to do with social justice or equality, or the betterment of the human race. Instead, it is a system designed to maintain the interests of one elect group of people over and above all others. That elect group of people were allowed to own slaves and to abuse their own slaves at will. They were allowed to slaughter and dominate neighbouring cities, towns and countries, and to commit mass crimes and genocide. They were allowed to do pretty much anything they wanted. So we see that democracy has its roots in oppression and the law of the jungle, and has got nothing to do with freedom or responsible governance or in organised law and order. but rather in organised warfare and colonisation, and in developing more effective systems of organised oppression and exploitation of others. That is curious, because today we are propagandised to believe that democracy is all about freedom. How is it that we have come to confuse democracy with human freedom and equality, when in fact it has its roots in the complete opposite? Many people will say that modern democracy is a very different thing and is nothing like the Greek system, and that our democratic system is about freedom and serving the human community. Yet that is clearly not true. Modern democracy is modelled exactly on the Greek system, and when it was adopted by the United Kingdom, for example, it wasn't much different from the Greek system at all. It served a select group of privileged people, allowed them to have slaves, allowed them to abuse their own slaves and their own wives, allowed them to exploit their own population with forced labour, allowed them to do as they pleased in other countries, and to massacre and oppress vast numbers of people, and force them to serve their own interests. That is the root of modern democracy, the exact same root as the Greek democracy. Yet many today will still insist that democracy is freedom and is the path to human liberation and is progressive. They will point out that while the origins of modern democracy may well have served an elite group and privileged them above all others, that is not the case today, and that people in modern democracies today have fought to have those rights granted to themselves, and so are now free, or at least freer than they were before. That is certainly the myth of modern democracies, but of course it is a myth, because all that has really happened is that the definition of that elect group who profit from the machinations of state power and aggression, the theft of land, the violence, the economic subjugation of other peoples, all that has happened is that that elect group has been widened to include other sectors of society. But that does not change the fact that modern democracies are systems of violence and oppression designed to serve an elite and to profit that elite above the interests of all others. But the staunch defender of democracy will still further insist that because democracy is progressive, it will eventually subsume the whole world, and then everyone will be a citizen, and no one will be oppressed. Yes, it is possible that the whole world might become one democratic system, something along the lines of the European Union, but that does not at all vindicate democracy as a system of human freedom and liberation, because it ignores the fact that having a vote in a democratic system makes very little difference at all as to whether you are free and liberated or not. Are the tens of thousands of poor people in the inner city area where I live free and liberated? Is that why they are lying on the street drunk or with needles hanging out their arms? Is that why there is constant violence and sexual abuse? Is that why there is staunch nationalism and racism? The answer is no. These things exist because they are oppressed and traumatised, and these social problems are symptoms of the underlying social trauma that is the foundation of democracy. Democratic systems exist to exploit people, not to liberate them. Every single democratic system ever devised existed to exploit people. All of the propaganda of democratic systems is to cover over this one salient fact. By covering it over, people in democratic countries can continue to accrue wealth, demand high wages, and then justify that by saying that those opportunities are available to everyone. But those opportunities are not available to everyone. They never have been, and they never will be, not in a democratic system, because democratic systems are about empowering an elite class to rule over others and to exploit others. They are not and never have been about equality or human freedom from oppression. Ask yourself, has there ever been in human history a democratic system that elected a group of people who promised freedom from oppression for all, and economic freedom for all, and an end to war, and peace and cooperation with all countries, and an end to exploitation? The answer is no, never, not even anything remotely close. Democratic countries elect governments that promise war exploitation, and the sharing of the benefits of that economic exploitation and more with just enough people to get them voted in. That is what democratic countries do, because democracy has got nothing to do with human freedom or equality, or in ending oppression, but just in advantaging oneself over others. In fact, the very notion of democracy enshrines the law of the jungle, for it promises only one thing: mob rule. That is, if one mob is bigger than the other, then that mob will be allowed to rule and decide what everyone else should do, and the rules that everyone else should follow. That is mob rule. It is an authoritarian system where the biggest mob is allowed to become the dictator. Since when has mob rule been equated with proper governance, with law and order, and human freedom and equality? The answer is ever since mob rule was called democracy and hailed as something amazing and advanced, rather than as something primitive and exploitative. Mob rule is no way to organise a society, because mob rule will always serve the baser interests. Mob rule or democracy suits the Machiavellian type, those who machinate behind the scenes, devise plots and intrigues, and secretly serve their own interests while pretending to serve the common good. Mob rule is the court society of kings and queens, where everyone hides their daggers behind their backs and pretends that they are all in it together and serving the common interest, while they are in fact serving only themselves. So democracy is not really democracy at all. By that I mean democracy is not designed to serve the common good, or the community, or to provide a voice and equal participation for all. Neither is democracy designed to allow one human community to engage meaningfully with another, and to develop cooperatively. Democracy is mob rule, where the mob that rules does so with a view to its own interests, and in maintaining those interests over and above all other mobs out there. Usually when we use the word democracy, we mean a system of governance that represents the interests of the communities that it governs, that is answerable to and only to those communities, and that seeks to cooperate with other democratic systems. I hope I have made it clear that that is not what democracy does, and the fact that we have associated this with the word democracy is the prime reason why the word anarchy has come to mean chaos and the law of the jungle, when in fact that is what our democracies are. It is a projection, because it is anarchy that seeks to develop systems of living that do not oppress others and that rely upon genuine democracy and cooperation with the members of its own society and that of others. That has never been the rationale behind modern democracy, but that is the rationale behind anarchy. In an anarchist system, people do not rely upon the exploitation of others. In a democratic system, they do. Many people will say that anarchy can never work, when what they really mean is that they want to continue profiting from the exploitation of others and don't want to give up that privilege. So anarchy is not for them. Because anarchy works just fine. You don't need to wait for the world to turn into a utopia to practice anarchy. One can simply start straight away by refusing to exploit others, whether human or animal, by refusing to live beyond your means as a biological being of the earth, by refusing to pollute the commons, and by standing up to oppose corruption, war, exploitation, ecological destruction and pollution, and all forms of oppression. One can easily practice anarchy, so to say that anarchy can't work is meaningless. We can live on the earth without waging war and exploiting others right now if we want, but mostly people want to hold on to their empire and do not want to give it up. So we really see that the problem is not other people, it is ourselves, and when we deny that, we end up blaming others for the problems in the world, when the truth is, it is ourselves and our own demands for privilege. I have a picture of Table Mountain in South Africa on the wall of my living room. I have no connection to South Africa, but I wanted pictures on my walls, and so I picked whatever they had going for cheap in the local charity shops, and used those to decorate my walls with. The city of Cape Town lies at the foot of Table Mountain, between it and the sea, and the picture shows the sea in the foreground with the city of Cape Town in the distance, dwarfed by Tabletop Mountain rising behind it. Sometimes I imagine inheriting some money and moving there, and imagine what life would be like, whether I'd be happy, what I would do, and so on. I get to thinking, how is it that money could allow me to live in South Africa? Is it because the human communities there embrace foreigners and want to open their lands so that we can join them? Of course, the answer is no. The fact is that the local communities were subjugated by European colonists and killed, enslaved, or forcibly moved from the land. The land was then privatised into the hands of a wealthy elite, who then provided it to others to use for a fee. At the heart of democracy is land ownership, which is ultimately taken by force, by murder and theft, and then carried on in that tradition down the generations. That is what democracy does to real human communities, not just in South Africa, but everywhere, including Europe. It does not liberate them, or allow them to be free, or provide them with a voice and a system of governance that represents them. It destroys them everywhere it goes, and it does so by force, by mob rule, by violence. It is one of the worst systems of governance imaginable, where one allows the biggest mob to rule over the rest. It is what people think anarchy is, the law of the jungle and chaos. Once we have understood that, we are ready to embrace anarchy and to take seriously what it means to be part of a human, earth-centered community that seeks to live symbiotically and not parasitically. So far I have given a critique of democracy, but I've not talked about what anarchy as a political system or way of organising society might look like. This is because anarchy is a system that springs from the collective actions of individuals who are all engaged in the process of living without oppressing others. The collective system that arises from the collective actions of a society composed of such individuals, or of a given number of such individuals, cannot be prescribed beforehand, but rather emerges organically or naturally, rather than dogmatically or in an ideological fashion. I would imagine each such society would be unique, and there would be no formulaic system that applied to all. Many would consider that a cop-out, but of course it is really only the authoritarian that seeks to find a formula for how to run society that can then be applied to everyone, and not the anarchist. The anarchist concerns herself with living in a way that does not oppress others, and working collectively with others to that end. One can be an anarchist in an authoritarian society, just as one can be anarchist in an anarchist society. The actions of others is irrelevant to the practice of anarchy, though in a strongly authoritarian society, such as a communist, socialist or fascist society, being anarchist may likely end up with your execution or imprisonment. So anarchy is not a fixed, robotic ideology, but rather something organic that emerges from the collective actions of individuals, each striving to live ethically and without oppressing others. That has one very important consequence, and that is this: anarchy is not a revolution that happens overnight. It is something that emerges as more and more people begin to live and act ethically, with humanity, responsibility, and with integrity. Many people today decide that changing their lifestyle or their way of life, that is, taking personal responsibility for yourself, is not going to achieve anything, but that rather what is needed is systemic change, which can only be achieved by asking existing power structures, such as corporations, banks or governments, to change their ways. This is personal disempowerment, and is also a poor excuse for continuing to live off the exploitation of others and the pollution and destruction of the earth. This, to me, is not anarchism. With anarchy, the complete opposite is the case, for it is only by taking personal responsibility yourself for your own actions and their impact on the commons and on others that a new way of collective living will ever emerge. For that new way of collective living will only come about when the collective actions of many such individuals reaches a critical mass. We think in our disempowered state that only the powerful can change the world. We forget that the powerful have never changed the world. The powerful seek to keep the world as it is and to make it easier for themselves to maintain that power and to increase it, not to create a new system where it doesn't exist. We also forget that centralized authoritarian power is not the glue that holds societies together and that maintains the societal order. It never has been, even under the most tyrannical systems. It is and always will be social conformity and the pressure to conform to societal expectations. Parasitic governing structures, whether democratic or autocratic, simply exploit the existing social order. They do not invent it, but rather just take advantage of it. One could never, ever achieve a totalitarian dictatorship or an authoritarian majority rules democracy in a society of anarchists. It cannot happen. So we see that it is the choices that individuals make that determines the social order, and not the threat of any centralized power structures, which are always simply a reflection of the existing social order. So anarchy is a very difficult thing to describe en masse, as it is such an organic system, but at the same time it is very easy to describe in terms of what the individual does. The individual maintains their individual autonomy and seeks to live without oppressing others and to stand up to authoritarianism and exploitation. That does not require a society of anarchists to do, and if one waits for such a society to emerge, then it never will, by definition of what anarchy is. Anarchy is something one puts into practice wherever one is, not a revolution that you wait around for. Despite the inherent problem in describing what an anarchist society may look like, one can nevertheless give opinions as to the types of societal structures and institutions that may emerge so long as they are understood to be rough outlines rather than formulaic descriptions. The danger of anarchy becoming an ideology is all too real, and this must be avoided, as ideologies, like capitalism or socialism, are the prescriptions of authoritarians. Anarchy is not a political system or an ideology, but a way of living as an individual that does not oppress others, and a collective way of living that emerges organically from the results of many such individuals. By its nature, it is very hard to predict what such a system will look like. Nevertheless, I shall give my own opinions as to the features that you may expect to see within an anarchist society. I see anarchy, even within a complex, modern, global society like ours, very much along the lines of the systems of Indian village democracy, which is based on small communities making decisions through a consensus process, rather than mob rule or majority decisions. Everybody gets their say, and decisions are reached through a process of deliberation that may or may not involve one or more individuals within the community who are appointed to serve as decision makers for a period. I would imagine a modern city such as Manchester, where I live, being composed of many thousands of such communities, with each community being perhaps 100 or a few hundred people strong. It is difficult to envision a modern state being run in this fashion, and I think there would be a consensus among most anarchists that modern states would no longer exist in an anarchist society. As more and more people adopted more ethical and autonomous ways of living, one would eventually see the breakup and disintegration of the modern state, which is really only the vehicle for the expression of authoritarian power. This need not happen through any violence or confrontation, but rather through a transformation of the social body itself in the manner in which I have described. Of course, one cannot rule out confrontation, and this is probably very likely to occur throughout the transition period. As more and more people begin to develop anarchist ways, confrontations are probably inevitable. This is, in fact, an important element of social transformation, and is why open confrontation with the police, the state, and other centres of authoritarian power has always been embraced by anarchists, and is a key component of anarchist social theory. So I would expect to see the breakup of the state under an anarchist system and the emergence of the village community as the central organising principle behind everyday life. Of course, I use the word village to mean a community of perhaps 100 to several hundred strong, and which may well exist within the confines of a city composed of many thousands of such communities. These communities are almost certainly going to organise together and develop structures for doing so. That means that, although the modern state will no longer exist, that does not mean an end to mass society, to modern society, or to cities and large governing structures, or to coordinated law and order. One could quite easily envision a city like Manchester breaking up into thousands of communities, which then develop a proper democratic system which is capable of governing Manchester on behalf of those communities. Such a system is not a state, as there is no parasitic class of landowners, or wealthy industrialists, or centralised political parties, or banks and corporations. Such a system of governance, let's call it a People's Assembly, would consist of individuals chosen by their community, and who are answerable directly to that community, and who can be replaced at will by that community. In this way, no political class of elites can ever emerge, as can no system of fixed and centralised political parties, and the system remains truly democratic. One can envision a country like the UK containing many such cities run by people's assemblies on behalf of the village communities within them, and of the rural areas of the UK being similarly organised. Such a system can again unite, if need be, to form a greater political body on the national scale, a larger assembly, though I would expect that would only occur under exceptional circumstances, such as a common threat like climate change. I would imagine each village community to be organised around a collective endeavour, such as a village workshop producing goods or a farm producing food. These would be collectively organised and owned, without any hierarchy or factory boss. Alternatively, such communities may be formed around cottage industries, such as weaving or handcrafts, and whole city areas may consist solely of communities engaged in these crafts within their own homes, as was the case before industrialisation. These systems may seem like fantasy, but in fact the earliest cities were organised in exactly this fashion. These cities had no kings or queens, no central power or hierarchy, and their systems of production were collectively owned, as they appear to have no elites living within the cities, as is evidenced by a lack of large houses or rich burials. They never waged war, and had no mass weapons, such as shields, helmets or swords. These early cities contained as many as 50,000 people, had running water and toilets in their homes, made sea-going ships and built harbours, developing sophisticated systems of trade, and existed for 1,000 to 2,000 years or more in ancient India, long before Europe had developed any city-based civilizations. It is a civilization known as the Indus-Sarasvati civilization in modern-day India and Pakistan. So anarchy is not a pipe dream. It is a practical and realistic way to organise society around human-sized communities that work in cooperation with themselves and with other communities. It is not an ideology, but rather an organic system that emerges from the collective actions of decent people working for the common good in a sustainable and ethical manner. It is a system that can never emerge by voting for a political party, or by asking the government to do something, or through waiting for systemic change, but which rather occurs through taking full personal responsibility and actively engaging the social body in the manner most appropriate for your personal situation. It is the life that human beings were born to live, but which through complex historical reasons has not yet emerged. The world is still in thrall to centralised systems of power, and in living off the fruits of the exploitation that those systems of power provide. I would like lastly to consider the spiritual perspective that yoga offers before I finish this podcast. The world we see is a manifestation of a deeper layer of mind than the physical mind we are caught up in and identified with, a layer that Carl Jung called the psychoid. Our biology is rooted in this deeper layer of mind, and our physical body springs from it, just as a plant springs from an underground tuber. The psychoid layer of our mind is like the tuber, and the plant that grows from the tuber is like the physical body with which we live each successive life. Just as each plant that grows nourishes the tuber and prepares the way for the next season of plant growth, so too does each body and the life it lives nourish the psychoid layer of mind and prepare the way for the next life that we will live. We can call this karma or simply the mechanics of biological life. Either way, with this higher view, one can realize that it is our personal actions and only our personal actions that determine the manner of our successive lives. If we decide to follow the crowd and not to take any responsibility until others do, then we will create the karma for our future lives to be reborn into this world again and again, and to experience the dystopia and suffering that its people are going to experience. With the spiritual viewpoint, we can see that personal action and individual responsibility are the only thing that will solve the world's problems. Nothing else possibly can, because it is only by taking personal action that we can create the causes to experience a life in a world free of oppression and environmental destruction. We may not be able to save the world, which is a pretty grandiose, egoistic aim anyway, but we can save our world, our portion of it, the portion that springs from our own psychoid tuber, and we can only do that by taking personal responsibility ourselves and changing our ways to suit what the planet can actually sustain, and to change our ways to live more harmoniously with each other. As long as we continue to embrace systems like democracy, we continue to engage in exploitation and domination, and we will always experience such systems of living, systems which will become terrifying vehicles of great suffering for current and future generations born into them. That is what makes anarchy and the practice of anarchy so important for the practitioner of yoga, and for those seeking to enter the Aquarian Age. For the Aquarian Age is an age of genuine freedom, cooperation, and of harmonious living upon the earth. It is a living example of anarchy in action, where communities are living in systems free of oppression and exploitation. The practice of anarchy in our day-to-day life, in our relations with the planet, its organisms and each other, is the means by which we undo the karma that ties us to the exploitative and dominating systems of governance that we live in today, thus allowing ourselves to be reborn into the Aquarian Age and not to be destroyed in the spiritual holocaust that our current culture is creating. I'm going to end this episode of the Aquarian Age podcast there. I hope you have found the discourse on anarchy and the Aquarian Age illuminating, and I will speak again soon.